Good evening. With the news today that DC Comics will be ending their Vertigo imprint, I had a few thoughts that I wanted to share. I guess get my fledgling channel here some content so that you can all appreciate what you subscribe to, all 20 plus of you. In any case, so Vertigo Comics means a lot to me. It means it's hard to put into words what it meant. It meant a bridge of sorts. Whereas I got older, I could continue my love of comics as I found the stories that Marvel and DC produced to be not fledgling, but not as interesting. So without further ado, I guess I'll just jump right in here. Bear with me a minute. All right. All right, so just checking my, all right. Now, Vertigo Comics. Today is the death. So the death of Vertigo, or how I learned to stop accepting mediocre stories and love comics again. Why was Vertigo created? Vertigo was created by DC to offer more freedom from the Comics Code Authority in 1993. They were looking to publish stories that stepped beyond the stagnation that had erupted into the medium. Initially, there were several books that were formerly of the main DC line that were brought in, most of them in mid-run. These were Shade, The Changing Man, issue 33, Sandman, 47, issue 47, Hellblazer, issue 63, Animal Man, issue 57, Swamp Thing, issue 129, and Doom Patrol was actually kicking off that month with a new direction with Rachel Pollack's debut on the issue, and that was issue 64. She was the new writer on that series. So what was Sandman? Sandman was Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman doing something that was so incredibly different from anything that had been done before. It was this overarching story that had this built-in mythology with adult themes, and it fit perfect with what Karen Bergren, the editor-in-chief of Vertigo, put in charge by DC, was looking to accomplish. Animal Man was, I'm not that familiar with it. I've got a few copies. I always thought the art was striking, but it wasn't one that really resonated with me. But again, it offered those more adult-oriented stories that you weren't seeing in the main DC line. Obviously, Hellblazer with John Constantine, who was originally debuted in another one of the books that we're going to get to with Swamp Thing, Saga of Swamp Thing, before it dropped the Saga of and just switched to Swamp Thing. Hellblazer 63 was a pretty special issue. It was John Constantine's birthday issue. And it was kind of appropriate that as Constantine went through this metamorphosis of life as he had his birthday and became 40, it was a change for John Constantine. And this was a change for DC Entertainment. This was a change for DC Comics to go and have this Vertigo line that was that offered such different fare, more adult-oriented fare that bridged the gaps that were present. Then you had an interesting book that's often overlooked even today. That's Peter Milligan's Shade, The Changing Man. Very, very highly regarded by most. I've only spot read a few issues. But Milligan's work, I think, actually, like his premier work, comes in after he kind of cuts his teeth on Shade and gets his feet underneath him. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because there's a couple of books that I really want to spend some time on that I'm very passionate about and more familiar with. So then you have Swamp Thing. I own just about every Vertigo print of this particular Swamp Thing run. The Nancy Collins era was, I thought, excellent. It dips a little bit later on when Miller comes aboard, but you're well past its heyday of Moore. You're well past its heyday of some of the other authors that were in there, but it was still an excellent book. And then, of course, Doom Patrol, the ever popular Doom Patrol, was then also put in under the imprint. But the first comic that was actually produced exclusively under the name Vertigo was Death, the High Cost of Living, which was an offshoot of Sandman, focusing on his sister Death. And that was in a 3-issue limited run by Gaiman and Bacalo. And when these issues just jumped off the shelves when you saw them, they were so different than anything else that was out at the time. And it was just, they stood in stark contrast to the colorful garbed superheroes that you saw everywhere else on the shelf. And it offered just something different. Now, earlier I had mentioned Peter Milligan, and I want to take some time and talk about Enigma, because I feel Enigma was probably the most groundbreaking book that came within the early year or so of the first year that Vertigo was around. Art imitates life sometimes, and sometimes life imitates art. Under rare and ominous conditions, the two become inextricably wound into each other. An Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. In Enigma, it was even weirder than that, though, and that's the starting kind of the pitch line that Enigma came off. It was about an existential superhero who was in a less than extraordinary world. It was about a man seeking his hero, trying to find his hero, who was an enigma, and then try to rationalize how that world applied to himself. The art by Duncan Fegredo was, I mean, just, it still stands out if you look at it. It's just, and this is the classic Vertigo, is these books were just so magical because they jumped right off the shelf at you. And I know I've said that a couple of times, but it's true. I can think back to my early teens and walking into a shop and these books they cried out to be picked up and flipped through and read. And they're great. And all of these were were suggested for mature readers. Like I said earlier, they did not follow the Comic Code Authority. And it's just, you don't see books like this anymore. There was something special in those first few years. And really, I mean, it carried on with some of the titles and some of the other things that were released. But we'll get into that a little bit later, I suppose. But this one, Sandman Mystery Theater. There are a few characters, there are a few books that I go out of my way to try to find, to try to search for, to complete runs. The Sandman Mystery Theater run is one of those. It was Wesley Dodds, who was a classic old Golden Age hero. They brought him back. They tied it into Neil Gaiman's Sandman. So as Morpheus was of the Dreaming was held captive by the sorcerer, his powers were kind of fractured and distributed, and throughout history, throughout time, people tried to take up that mantle, and Wesley Dodds took up the mantle in the form of the Sandman. And it was a street level, gritty noir, modern noir. It was this, they did this weird thing where even though it was set in the 30s, they took concepts and ideals from the 90s and somehow managed to get them all blended together. And some of these stories were just amazing. They were just, there were mini arcs within larger arcs. It was kind of a European format of storytelling. So you'd have a story like, I mean, some of the Tarantula that would go on for 5 issues, but then the Faceless Man or the Ripper would they would harken back to something that happened in issue 4 of that previous arc, and again, constantly building the stories, constantly changing the path forward, ever evolving. They were it was written by Matt Wagner, drawn, and Guy Davis. They just, I mean, if you've ever read any of Denny O'Neill's The Question and kind of some of the Eastern philosophy that's drawn across in that, Sandman Mystery Theater was able to tap into that, but take it a step further, even a little bit. Probably handle some of the things in a little bit more of an adult, rational way than Gaiman was doing with his own Sandman book with existentialism and some of the ideas and philosophies that wrap around that. I suppose you could say maybe I'm reading a little too much into it, but Sandman Mystery Theater, I think, was maybe the high watermark, I suppose, of some of the books in those first few years that came out. And this book lasted until 1999, and over 100-issue run. It's if you go out and you find there's trades that collect some of the stories, I highly recommend them. They're all excellent. But so some closing thoughts. I don't want to ramble too long here and bore you to tears. But so Vertigo was founded, as I said, in 1993. Up until the end, December of 2012, Karen Berger reigned as the editor-in-chief of the imprint. And up until 2012, although it didn't have the same legs that it had for those first few years, Vertigo was still something special. They still jumped off the shelf. I spent about a decade away from comics, but I was still picking up the occasional trade or the occasional floppy. And most of those books that I was picking up at the time were Vertigo books, because they approached story in a way that challenged your mind. It wasn't just pure escapism. And I think that's something that's missed often, is that a comic book is not always just about escapism. A comic book can make you think. It can challenge your thoughts. It can challenge your ideals. And there's a time for escapism, and then there's a time to maybe move on to excellent, challenging stories that focus on things that maybe we don't want to talk about in polite company, and we want to handle in a little bit of a different way. And that's what Vertigo handled very well. Never obtrusive, never over the head. It was always very subtle. They were written exceptionally well. Karen Berger there's a reason she was awarded as many awards as she was. She was a phenomenal editor. And she still is doing phenomenal work over at Dark Horse with Berger Books. So why did Vertigo fail? Why, after 25 plus years, does DC Comics want to close down Vertigo? Well, it's because Vertigo meant something. And when things mean something, there are people in this world that want to change that meaning to suit their own agenda. And in this case, the postmodernist woke politics, deconstructionalism, was injected into a brand that had power, that had name recognition, that truly meant something within the small fledgling fandom known as comic books. And when those woke politics crashed against the Dover cliffs of the realities of capitalism, Vertigo was the one that drowned. And anyone today who's weeping in the industry, and if you look out on Twitter, especially if you go to Miss Karen Berger's feed and look at her farewell, her Viva Vertigo post, the names that you'll see underneath that are a lot. They're very famous names. There's a lot of people that worked at Vertigo at one time or another. There's people that still work at Vertigo. There's people that just appreciated Vertigo that are professionals. And all of those in the industry who weep today, or who are saying it's so sad that Vertigo is failing, you need to dry your eyes and you need to wake up from your slumber, because your colleagues killed Vertigo. DC Comics didn't kill Vertigo. The people that put the editor in charge, the people that released books like Border Town, the people that released the Goddess Mode, those books, this last wave of Vertigo books that were this political agenda, that's what killed Vertigo. Moving out people like Karen Berger and the lady that followed her was Shelley Bond, and Shelley goes back to the founding of Vertigo as one of the original series editors. Removing those two women and the shakeup that followed Bond's removal in 2016 when James Rich took over, and then following Rich when Doyle took over, really it starts under Rich, but Doyle's responsible for what's happening today. But this is all, it's because of those woke politics. And any of these professionals that are crying about, oh, it's so sad to see Vertigo die. Well, guys, you're responsible. Your friends are responsible. Your ideology is driving you not only out of a job, but it's strangling an industry that's tenuously holding on to relevance within a culture that changes daily. 1 week in the real world is an eternity on Twitter. And in that eternity, one misstep can cost a book its future, and multiple missteps can cost an imprint its future as well. And that's why Vertigo's doors will be closing at the end of this year. So as a close, I'd like to read Miss Karen Berger's, the editor-in-chief of Vertigo, the award-winning editor. I'd like to read her tweet about what she thinks, and that is, corporate thinking and creative risk-taking don't mix. DC nixing Vertigo was a long time coming. But hey, we changed the game and we had a blast doing it. Honored to have worked with so many incredibly talented creators and editors, and thanks to our fab readers. I believe that that's sincere. I believe that there's sincere sadness on Miss Berger's part. And when I read that, perhaps that's me waxing poetic, if you will. But I think there's a path forward. And what I think that path forward is what we have before us in Comicsgate. And what everybody needs to do is to, this is about, as a wise man said this week, and I really respect the individual that said this, because time and time again, he has been at the forefront of this struggle over the last year. And I think these words are very important given what's happened today with Vertigo, because we can't let the infighting and we can't let the bickering get in the way of the path. And the path is this. This is about comic books. It's about good comic books. Wasting time on the internet arguing back and forth is accomplishing nothing. If you find yourself sitting there tweeting out constantly multiple dozens of tweets in a 15-minute span or a 30-minute span back and forth with somebody, close Twitter, open up a Word document, write a book, go grab a pen, grab a pencil, grab a pad of paper, draw something. Be part of the solution. Don't be part of the problem. Part of the problem with what happened with Vertigo was that argumentative style. You're going to argue with your readers. You're going to argue with your populace. You're going to try to shove what you think down the throat of everyone else. And it's toxic and it destroys it. So listen to those wise words in the face of Vertigo failing. Let this be the bellwether call for everybody to get back in Comicsgate on the same page. And that's it. That's all I had to say. I try to be a man of few words. I fail often. But I appreciate everybody stopping by, and appreciate everybody listening to what I had to say. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.